Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to break something. Or maybe it's better to say we're going to watch a scholar take a sledgehammer to a very specific, very cherished idea about the foundation of Western civilization.
It is definitely a disruptive piece of scholarship. It's one of those books that once you read it, you can't really look at a map of the ancient world the same way again.
We're diving into Hellenosemitica by Michael C. Astour, published back in 1965. And I know 1965 sounds like a while ago, but the idea we're tackling is even older. It's the miracle of Greece.
Right. The miracle. This is that 19th century, very romanticized idea that Greek civilization, democracy, philosophy, the Iliad, it all just sprang up out of the European soil in complete isolation.
Sure, European area.
Exactly. The dominant narrative was that the Greeks were this unique, genius people who had absolutely nothing to do with the Orient, the Semitic civilizations to the east, like the Phoenicians or the Canaanites. The idea was that Greece was this fortress of European identity, totally untouched.
But Astor's whole thesis is that the ancient Mediterranean wasn't a bunch of isolated ponds where everyone just stayed put.
No, it was an interconnected lake.
And he focuses on one massive, really controversial connection, a West Semitic impact on Mycenaean Greece. He argues that the famous Danans, the Greeks of Homer's Iliad, the guys who fought the Trojan War, are directly connected to a Semitic tribe in Turkey
Called the Danunians.
So Achilles and Agamemnon, the poster boys of Western heroism, might actually have cultural cousins in the Middle East.
In a way, yes. It's a deep rabbit hole. It involves bilingual inscriptions, diplomatic letters from pharaohs, and a lot of linguistic detective work.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to understand why this book was such a bombshell, you have to understand the wall of silence that existed before it.
That's a great way to put it. Before the mid-20th century, the academic world wasn't just skeptical of Eastern influence on Greece, it was actively hostile to it. You have to remember the context of late 19th century Europe. Nationalism was on the rise, and there was this real desire to draw a hard line between the West and the East.
The source mentions a scholar, Julius Balak, in the 1890s. He sounds like he was the ringleader of this whole movement.
Balak was. Well, he was aggressive. He argued that literally all reports of Phoenicians in Greece were just baseless myths. He went so far as to claim that figures like Cadmos and Adonis, who have very obviously Semitic names.
Wait, hold on. Adonis. Isn't Adon just the Hebrew and Phoenician word for lord?
It is. It's about as Semitic as you can get. Adon means lord. But the bias was so strong, Astour calls it an undeniable partiality, that they just refused to see it. They would twist themselves into knots to find some Indo-European or, Nordic root for these names rather than admit a Semitic origin.
So they were basically starting with the conclusion Greeks are pure Europeans and then working backward to make the evidence fit.
Precisely. There was this one scholar, Victor Berard, who tried to argue that the Odyssey was based on Phoenician sea charts. He laid out some really compelling geographic evidence. And what did the academic community do? They didn't just refute him, they intentionally ignored him. For decades, they just froze him out.
So what broke the dam? How did we get from no Semites allowed to Astour being able to publish Hellenosemitica?
Two massive disruptions forced a reevaluation. First, in the 1950s, Michael Ventris deciphered Linear B.
And that's the script they found on the clay tablets in all of the Mycenaean palaces, right?
Correct. For the longest time, nobody knew what language it was. Ventris proved it was an early form of Greek. But, and this is the interesting part, the society described in those tablets didn't look like classical Athens at all. It looked like a Near Eastern palace economy. It was bureaucratic, centralized, very heavily influenced by the East.
So the purity argument started to crack from the inside.
Exactly. Then you had Cyrus Gordon doing work on Linear A in Crete, suggesting Semitic origins there. But for Astour, the motivation was, it was deeply personal. And I think this context is so important.
This part blew my mind. The source says he was imprisoned in the USSR.
Yes. Astour was a Jewish scholar who spent a decade in Soviet political prisons and labor camps, starting in 1939. He was eventually exiled to the Asiatic part of the USSR.
And while he's in exile, completely cut off from the Western academic world, he finds something.
In 1950, while he's still in exile, he stumbles upon a journal article about a discovery in Turkey, the Keratopia discovery. And even with no hope of publishing, no access to a real library, he starts formulating this whole theory in his head, in notebooks. He was connecting these newfound Danunians in Turkey to the Greek Danans while sitting in a Soviet gulag.
Wow. Talk about dedication. That really raises the stakes. This wasn't just some tenure project for him.
Not at all.
So let's talk about this smoking gun he read about, the Karatepe Revelation. What did they find in Turkey?
Okay, so between 1945 and 1947, archaeologists are digging in eastern Cilicia, that's modern southern Turkey, right near the Syrian border. They unearth an 8th century BC fortress. And inside, they find the holy grail of archaeology, a bilingual inscription.
Two languages saying the same thing, like a Rosetta Stone.
Exactly like that. One version was in Hittite hieroglyphs, which was sort of the prestige language of Anatolia. The other version was in Phoenician.
Which is a West Semitic language, the language of the traders in the Levant.
Right. And the person who wrote the inscription, a king named Izidawad, he declares himself the king of the Dananians. In Phoenician, it's written Diem.
So we have a king in Turkey in the 8th century BC calling his people the Danunians and writing about it in Phoenician. That seems pretty straightforward. Why was it controversial?
Because of where it was. This is Turkey, and that old clash of scholars kicked right back in. The skeptics historians like Laroche and Seton Lloyd, they looked at this and said, okay, sure, they're writing in Phoenician, but they aren't actually Semites.
How can you even argue that? If I write a letter in English, it's a pretty safe bet that I speak English.
Their argument was that the Danunians were true Anatolians, basically Hittites or Luwians, with no real relation to the Semitic world. They claimed the king only used Phoenician as prestige language.
Oh, like how a medieval German king might use Latin for a decree to sound important.
That's the idea. He's using it to connect to the wider world, but his people don't actually speak it at home. They were trying to keep the Danunians in the Anatolian box to avoid that Semitic connection.
Because if the Danunians are Semitic, and if Astour is right that they're the same as the Greek Danaans.
The implication is massive. It means one of the founding Greek tribes has Semitic roots.
So how does Astour take apart that prestige language argument?
He goes straight to the text itself. He argues that the Phoenician text at Karatepe isn't some stiff formal translation. He says it's pure Phoenician. It has poetry, it has rhythm, it has parallelism.
Parallelism.
Yeah, it's a poetic structure that's completely native to Canaanite and Hebrew literature. You see it all over the Psalms. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. You repeat an idea in two different ways. Astour points out the Karatepe inscription is full of that specific literary device.
So it's not a clumsy translation. It feels native.
Exactly. Astour's point is you can't fake that. If the literature is this high quality, the population, or at least the ruling class, must have been native Semitic speakers. They weren't just borrowing a script, they were living inside the culture.
Okay, so let's accept Astour's premise for a minute. We have a Semitic-speaking people, the Danunians, living in southern Turkey. Now comes the big leap. How does he connect them to the Greeks? Because Karatepe is from the 8th century BC. The Trojan War, the Mycenaean Age, that was hundreds of years earlier.
That is the crucial chronological gap. If the Danunians are the ancestors of the Greeks, they had to be there in the Bronze Age, around the 14th or 13th century BC. If they only show up in the 8th century, the whole theory falls apart.
So he needs to find them in older records.
And for that, he turns to the Amarna letters.
Ah, the Amarna letters, a show favorite. For anyone new, these are the diplomatic clay tablets found in Egypt from around 1350 BC. It's basically the pharaoh's inbox.
It really is. And Astour hones in on letter EA 151. It's from Ebimilke, the king of Tyre, writing to Suro Akhenaten. Ebimilke is giving a status report on the whole region, and he reports, quite simply, the king of Danuna is dead, and his land is at peace.
Boom, Danuna, there it is, in the 14th century BC.
A definitive mention. But the problem, and with ancient history there's always a problem, is where was this Danuna? The letter doesn't give you GPS coordinates.
Right. So where does Astour place it?
This is where a huge academic turf war started. Based on the order that Ebimilke lists the cities, he says Ugarit, then Danuna, then Arvat Astour argues Danuna has to be north of Ugarit. And that puts it squarely in eastern Cilicia.
The exact same place the Karatepe inscription was found centuries later.
Right. It's just continuity. But this really challenged the Astour map. A lot of scholars thought that whole region was the kingdom of Kizzuwatna. They thought the city Adana and the kingdom Kizzuwatna were basically the same thing.
And why does that matter?
Because Kizzuwatna was a Hurrian Hittite state. If Adana is just a part of Kizzuwatna, then it's not Semitic. It's just another Anatolian province.
But Astour disagreed.
Strongly. He uses a specific treaty, the Unerjura Treaty, to prove that Adana and Kizzuwatna were actually separate entities. He paints a picture of Adana, the land of the Danunians, as a Semitic enclave.
An enclave?
Yeah, like a pocket of independence. While the Hittites were conquering Kazawatna and swallowing up the region, the land of Danuna seems to have stayed independent. Or maybe it was a direct vassal of Egypt. It was a bridgehead of Semitic culture that survived while its neighbors were being assimilated.
That puts them in a perfect position to be a bridge to the West. A maritime people connected to the Phoenicians living on the coast of Turkey.
And that leads to the wildest part of Astour's theory, the Hyksos connection.
The Hyksos, the Asiatic rulers who took over Egypt for a while, right?
Yes, and when the Egyptians finally kicked them out, they retreated back into the Levant. Astour suggests the Danunians might have been part of this huge migration, a wave of people spilling out of Egypt, moving up the coast, settling in Cilicia, and then eventually crossing the sea to Greece.
This is where the mythology has to come in, because if you're claiming a massive migration from the east to Greece, you'd expect the Greeks to, remember it.
You'd expect a story about it, and they do. The myth of King Danaos.
Okay, refresh our memory on the story of Danaos.
In Greek myth, Danaos is a king who comes explicitly from the east. Depending on the version, he's from Egypt or Phoenicia. He flees across the sea, lands in Argos in the Peloponnese, becomes king, and his descendants are the Danaans, the dominant tribe of the whole region.
So the Greeks themselves are explicitly saying, our ancestor came from the east.
They were very clear about it. Herodotus, Thucydides, they all talked openly about Phoenician settlements in Greece. It was the modern historians, the 19th century Germans and British.
So let me just chain this together. We have a city of the Lord, Adana, inhabited by the people of the Lord, the Danunians, who speak a Semitic language. And then across the sea, we have the Danaans, who say they descend from a king named Danaos.
It's a very tight chain. But Astour goes one step further. He looks at the Ugaritic texts found in Syria. There's a West Semitic epic called the Epic of Daniel.
Daniel, like the biblical...
Simpler root, yeah. God is my judge. But this Daniel is a healer hero in the Ugaritic tradition. Astour argues that this isn't just an accidental similarity in names.
He's saying the Epic of Daniel and the myth of Danaos are two different branches of the same cultural tree.
Exactly. He sees this Semitic-speaking Danunian kingdom in Cilicia as the missing link. It validates the Greek legends. The Greeks didn't just invent an Eastern origin for themselves, they were remembering a real historical migration.
It's fascinating because it gives physical geography to a myth. But myths are one thing. What about physical stuff? Did we find anything in the ground in Cilicia that says Greeks were here?
We did, though it's often been downplayed. The source mentions pottery found in Tarsus and Mersin cities, right there in that Cilician plain.
Mycenaean pottery.
Yes, a lot of it. Now, the standard skeptic response is always, oh, that's just trade. A few pots don't mean people move there.
Right. Just because I own a Japanese car doesn't mean I'm Japanese.
Oh, a fair point.
Yeah.
But Astour argues that the specific time frame after 1375 BC aligns perfectly with when we see this Danuna kingdom appearing in the records. He suggests it points to a settlement or maybe a cultural merger. The Greeks, the Danaans, and the Semites, the Danunians, were mixing in this coastal hub.
It paints a picture of such a cosmopolitan world. We tend to see the ancient world as these static blocks of color on a map. But you've got this coastal plain in Turkey where Hittites, Semites, and Mycenaean Greeks are all rubbing shoulders, swapping words, swapping gods.
And that is Astour's great victory. He broke that wall of silence by showing that you can't understand the Greeks without understanding their neighbors.
Let's circle back to that resistance for a second. The source highlights how hard they tried to keep the Danunians Anatolian. It wasn't just geography, it was theology, too.
Oh, absolutely. The Karatapi inscription mentions a specific god, Baal Krentri. The skeptics tried to argue this was just some local Hittite god with a Phoenician name slapped on top.
But Astour wasn't buying it.
Not at all. He analyzed the whole pantheon. He looked at the titles given to the gods, the epithets, and he showed they are pure Canaanite, with really close parallels in Phoenician, Ugaritic, and even Hebrew texts. It's not a Hittite religion wearing a Phoenician costume. It's a Semitic religion.
So looking at Hellenosemitica now, all these years later, did Astour win? Is this the accepted view?
Win is a tricky word in academia, but the door he kicked open never really closed again. We now accept that the Bronze Age was globalized. We accept that the Greeks got their alphabet from the Phoenicians. We accept their art was orientalizing. Astour pushed the pendulum hard away from that isolationist fantasy.
It sounds like he vindicated the ancients against the moderns.
That's a fantastic way to put it. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the oldest stories, the myths we dismiss as fairy tales, have a real kernel of truth in them.
And that the purity of any culture is almost always a myth itself. Civilization is built on connection, on migration, on the mixing of people.
Absolutely. The evidence was there, the myths were there. But for 50 years, scholars refused to connect the dots because they just didn't like the picture it created. Astour, maybe because of his own experiences as an outsider, as a prisoner, he was willing to see the connections that others just ignored.
So when we look at that Kara Tepe inscription today, what should we see?
I think we should see a testament to a lost world. A world where a king in Turkey could be a Semitic lord, speaking a language related to Hebrew, connected to a tribe that would one day become the heroes of Greek epic poetry. It shows us history is so much more fluid than our textbooks often let on.
That brings us to the end of this deep dive. We've gone from the prison camps of the USSR to the citadels of Mycenae, all by way of a fortress in Turkey.
A truly epic journey for a groundbreaking book.
I want to leave you with a thought to mull over. We always talk about Western civilization as this distinct thing, right? Separate from the East. But if the Danaans, the very Greeks who helped define what it means to be Western, have their roots in a Semitic tribe from Turkey and the Levant,
Does the strict distinction between East and West even exist in ancient history?
or is Western civilization actually at its very heart a child of the Semitic East?
Something to think about.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.